What's up people, Dunna here, and today we're going to be talking about something that a lot of people seem to be confused about, how slow motion actually works. Let's go! Now, if you're like me, when you first started making movies and first started making videos, you probably busted out whatever free software was on your computer already, and you thought, you know what, I'm gonna be able to do whatever the pros can do with their software with this. So you pull all your clips in and you start editing them together, and you're like, you know what, this one would look really good if I just slowed it right down. And so you take that little rabbit to the turtle thing that they have in there, the little slider, and you move it down to the other side, and what happens is you get a choppy, nasty, sloppy, gross looking mess of slow motion. And you kind of go, why? How do they do it? How do they make it look so smooth and buttery? And the trick to it is they shoot it specifically for slow motion. Now what the heck does that mean? What do you mean, Dunna? What's going on here? The key to understanding how slow motion works is understanding how video is shot and how it's played back. So it's kind of an in versus out situation. So typically when I shoot video, what I'm shooting at right now is called 24 frames per second. So what that means is that my camera is currently taking 24 pictures every second. And when it's played back in succession, 24 frames per second, it comes out as real speed because it's playing the same speed that it was recorded at. Now what you can do is you can record at a higher frame rate, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 120, 240, 480, all the way up to like thousands and thousands of frames per second. And when you play that back at a slower frame rate, so 24 frames per second, for example, it's gonna be a lot slower. So what I mean by this, let me break this down just a little further. If you shoot video at 60 frames per second, so you're taking 60 little pictures per second, and then you play it back at 24 pictures per second, what's happening is only the first 24 pictures that you took are being played back in a second now. So they're taking longer to get through the picture, so only 40% of what you actually shot is actually getting played back in that first second, and then another 40% in the next second. So what that means is that you can slow down 60 frames per second to 24 frames per second, and you're going to get 40% speed. So, you know, we've seen the little slider with the turtle and the rabbit on it to make it slower or faster. If we slowed it down to 40%, it should be about the same speed as if you were to shoot in 60 frames per second and move it down to 24 frames per second, but you're gonna get nowhere near as buttery smooth as if you actually do shoot it that way. So now that you understand how it works, the trick is actually doing it and being mindful of it when you're shooting. What shots are you gonna need in slow motion? What shots are gonna be okay if you do them in full speed? And if you can keep this in mind and even shoot things twice if you have to, if you're not sure, shoot it once in a high frame rate and shoot it once in normal frame rate, and you'll be good to go. You'll have the options later. Here's an example. So in this first shot, I shot my wife kicking these leaves, in this case in 24 frames per second. So this is full speed. And when I try and slow it down, you see it gets really nasty and choppy and it doesn't look very good. Now here's the same shot, but I shot it at 60 frames per second. Now when I play it back at 24 frames per second, you'll notice how much smoother it is. Buttery smooth, nice kicking of leaves. That's the look we're going for. Now the trick to this is something called interpret footage, and I'm using this in Premiere Pro, so that's what it's called, but it'll be a little bit different in whatever software you're using. So how to do this is make a new sequence at 24 frames per second, and then you right click on whatever clip it is you want, and you see it says 59, which is essentially 60. Right click, hit modify, interpret footage, and you're gonna type in 23.976, which is 24 frames per second. Now when I drag it into the timeline, it's gonna play it back. Instead of at the 60 frames per second that I shot it at, it'll play it at the buttery 24 frames per second. And bam, you got slow motion. Now, something to keep in mind is that you have to understand what your camera is capable of. So for example, my Sony a6000 can shoot at 60 frames per second at 1080p. So that's the fastest frame rate that it can shoot at. Some cameras can go faster, but sometimes you actually lose resolution as you go faster. So for example, like even the iPhone can shoot shoot at 120 frames per second and 240 frames per second, but as soon as you go up to 240 frames per second, you're gonna go down to only 720p, so you're no longer getting 1080p resolution that you had before. So it's just important to understand what your camera is capable of before you start shooting, because you would hate to shoot it in a high frame rate and then find out that it's chopping down to 720p. Now, one other thing that you can do if you forgot to shoot in a high frame rate is on Premiere Pro, they have something called optical flow. Now, what optical flow is, if you forgot to shoot in a high frame rate and you shot it at, let's say, 24 frames per second, and you want to slow it down, optical flow will attempt to create frames in between each frame so that it looks a little bit smoother. So it'll take frame 1 and frame 3, and it'll try and create frame 2 out of a composite of both of them, so that it tries to smooth out the motion that you have. It'll look something like this. So it's a little bit better, and it depends on the shot. Sometimes it works better and sometimes it doesn't, but it's still not quite as buttery smooth as if you just shot it in the first place in a higher frame rate. And now for the question of the day. In the comments below, let me know, what is your favorite thing to see in slow motion? I know there are video channels on YouTube that are dedicated just to slow motion. Do you like to see the bullets ripping through things, or do you like to see sports or water? What do you like to see? Make sure to leave it in the comments below. And if you want one more tip, make sure to check out the description for the bonus tip. In summary, remember that slow motion is all about frames per second in versus frames per second out. So if you shoot at a high frame rate and play it back slower, it's gonna be slow motion and it's gonna be buttery smooth. So be very intentional with what you're shooting at a high frame rate so you know it's gonna be slowed down. If something exciting is happening and you're gonna wanna edit it with some slow motion shots, make sure to shoot it at a higher frame rate. Thank you so much for watching. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel if you wanna see more. Hit that bell notification button so you don't miss any, and I'll see you next time.